Manoah said, now let thy words come to pass. How shall we order the child, and how shall we do unto him? This was a serious family. This was a family that loved God and that worked tirelessly to bring their lives into harmony with God's will. It's obvious from what Manoah says to the angel, how shall we order the child? We need to understand what your purpose is. Not everybody gets an angel to tell them that they're going to have children. Most children just happen, through the course of life. But this one is obviously special because God has a special work for him to do. And he understands this and he says, well, I want to know how I'm supposed to prepare him for this work. Verse 13, the angel of the Lord said unto Manoah, of all that I said unto the woman, let her beware. She may not eat of anything that cometh of the vine, neither let her drink wine or strong drink, nor eat any unclean thing. All that I commanded her, let her observe. And the angel of the Lord said unto Manoah, though thou detain me, I will not eat of thy bread. Whoops, I'm sorry, I passed by verse 15. Manoah said unto the angel of the Lord, I pray thee, let us detain thee until we have made ready a kid for thee. And the angel of the Lord said unto Manoah, though thou detain me, in other words, I'll let you detain me, but I will not eat thy bread. And if thou wilt offer a burnt offering, thou must offer it unto the Lord. In other words, don't offer it to me, offer it to God. In other words, I am thy fellow servant. In other words, I am just a servant of God to do what God bids. And so don't worship me, you worship God. Embedded in this story is the true worship of God, brothers and sisters. And in the last days, the central issue is worship, as you know. So once again, we're kind of seeing another parallel here, because the angel says to Manoah, don't worship me, worship God. And in the first angel's message, we learned that we are to worship God. Isn't that right? Fear God, give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment has come, and what? Worship him who made heaven and earth and sea and the fountains of waters. So, in other words, the Bible is telling us, Jesus is telling us, that we have the same privilege as Manoah and his wife in the last days, to focus and purify our lives by the worship of God and by living according to his will. So as you can see, the angel was interacting with Manoah and his family in a way that families and husbands and wives today are to interact with God in much the same way. Verse 17. The end of verse 16. For Manoah knew not that he was an angel of the Lord. And Manoah said unto the angel of the Lord, what is thy name? That when thy sayings come to pass, we may do thee honor. He still didn't quite get it, did he? And the angel of the Lord said unto him, why askest thou thus after my name, seeing it is a secret? Well, that's interesting. I'm not sure exactly how to interpret that part, but anyway. So Manoah took a kid with a meat offering and offered it upon a rock unto the Lord. And the angel did wondrously, and Manoah and his wife looked on. For it came to pass when the flame went up, how did the flame get there? By the angel working a wonderful miracle. When the flame went up toward heaven from off the altar, that the angel of the Lord ascended in the flame of the altar. And Manoah and his wife looked upon it and fell on their faces to the ground. But the angel of the Lord did no more appear to Manoah and to his wife. Then Manoah knew that he was an angel of the Lord. It wasn't just some stranger. This was a very special stranger. The angel of the Lord that flies in the midst of heaven is the messenger that God sends to bring the message of the three angels to the people of the world in this last generation. So again, we see another angel, as it were, a symbolic. This angel in the time of Manoah is, as it were, a type of the angel that is to fly in the midst of heaven in the last days. Okay? Now, verse 22. Manoah said unto his wife, we shall surely die, because we have seen God. But his wife said unto him, If the Lord be pleased to kill us, he would not have received a burnt offering and a meat offering at our hands. Neither would he have showed us all these things, nor would as at this time have told us such things as these. So she had common sense. He was afraid, and she said, look, if God we would have been killed long before this, if God intended that. 24, the woman bare a son and called his name Samson, and the child grew, and the Lord blessed him. Imagine Samson growing up in the home of this family. He was brought under the influences, the best influences in the home. The husband and wife fed him the right foods. They taught him temperance. They taught him how to have a balance in his life. They gave him all the advantages that a child that is destined to be a servant of God could have. Verse 25. And as he began to grow, it says, the Spirit of the Lord began to move him at times in the camp of Dan between Zorah and Eshtaol. So in other words, God started using him even as a young man. Here he was, still under his family's control, and the Lord is using him already to make him a servant of God. In other words, it becomes clear to the people around him that he is given a special work to do. Now we come to chapter 14, verse 1. Samson went down to Timnath and saw a woman in Timnath of the daughters of the Philistines. If ever there is something that has derailed a servant of God, it is a woman who is of the Philistines. And some of those who claim to be God's people are even really in heart of the Philistines. And if ever there is something that is going to delay or destroy or undermine the message of God for his people in the last days, it is going to be that his people, the men of God's choosing, philander with women of the world. I tell you what, I'm very impressed by the story of Billy Graham. Those of you who know him or knew him would know that he was very, very careful with how he related to women other than his wife and his daughters. He would not go into an elevator alone with a woman. He would not go into a hotel room first. Always an aide would go in first, so that he would make sure the room had nobody in there that would cause a problem for him, an integrity problem. This was a man of great integrity. As you know, he died not long ago. And you want to watch his funeral, you can see that on YouTube. Started about 2 hours and 20 minutes because they have a very long lead up to that, of just watching people come. But anyway, it was very interesting how this man had enormous respect. 1,500 people came to his private funeral. I wouldn't call that entirely private, especially since it was videoed live. But anyway, there were a lot of people. The point I'm trying to make is that God's people in the last days, especially those who proclaim the three angels' messages, must have integrity. They must be pure and holy. God will use them. But to follow after the women of the Philistines or any of those women out there that aren't living by God's principles would lead them down the wrong path. So it's very important if you have a calling for God's cause. Well, it's important for eternal salvation, let alone a calling for God's cause. Verse 2. And he came up and told his father and his mother and said, I have seen a woman in Timnath of the daughters of the Philistines. Now therefore get her for me to wife. What has happened to Samson? Somehow, something behind the scenes has been affecting him, and he now has an interest in a woman of the Philistines. Verse 3. His father and mother said unto him, Is there never a woman among the daughters of thy brethren, or among all my people, that thou goest to take a wife of the uncircumcised Philistines? And Samson said unto his father, Get her for me, for she pleases me well. An uncircumcised Philistine is basically representing someone who does not believe in God, who does not follow God's will, who is working against God's purposes. So, God says that we are not to be unequally yoked. Yet Samson began to pursue this woman. And he demanded that his father and mother get her for him. But his father and mother knew not that it was of the Lord. In other words, not that God ordained him to marry an uncircumcised Philistine, which is talking about the spiritual uncircumcision of the heart, of course. Because a woman can't be circumcised physically. So there you go. But Samson said unto his father, Get her for me, for she pleaseth me well. In other words, I want her no matter what. And his father and mother knew not that it was of the Lord. In other words, God was going to test Samson to show his fidelity to God. And then it says, For at that time the Philistines had dominion over Israel. God was going to use Samson to destroy Israel, or to not destroy Israel, to destroy the Philistines, or separate them from their control of Israel. Verse 5. Then went Samson down, and his father and his mother, to Timnath, and came to the vineyards of Timnath, and behold, a young lion roared against him. So the three of them were there together. Then Samson, verse 6, the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him, and he rent him as he would have rent a kid. And he had nothing in his hand, but he told not his father and his mother what he had done. So apparently, somehow his father and his mother weren't with him when he met the lion. It says that they went down together, but somehow, maybe while his parents were off getting this woman, he was confronting this lion. So they didn't know that he'd confronted this. And by the way, God often warns us. Here he was on the way down to marry a woman that was not part of God's order. And the lion comes along as if to attack him. It's as if it is a warning to Samson not to go forward with his plans. But he rends the lion. In other words, he tears this lion apart. And verse 7, he went down and talked with a woman, and she pleased Samson well. My friends, there have been many who have been preachers of truth and righteousness in these last days who have been sidetracked by uncircumcised Philistines, so to speak. And today, we have to learn that there is a lesson here that God has for us in the same way. Verse 8, after a time, he returned to take her, and he turned aside to see the carcass of the lion. And behold, there was a swarm of bees and honey in the carcass of the lion. And he took thereof in his hands, and went on eating, and came to his father and mother, and he gave them, and they did eat. But he told not them that he had taken the honey out of the carcass of the lion. Verse 10. So his father went down unto the woman, and Samson made there a feast, for so used the young men to do. And it came to pass, when they saw him, that they brought 30 companions to be with him. This is a wedding feast, right? And at this wedding feast, Samson said unto them, I will now put forth a riddle unto you, if ye can certainly declare it to me within the 7 days of the feast, and find it out, then I will give you 30 sheets and 30 changes of garments. But if ye cannot declare it to me, then shall ye give me 30 sheets and 30 changes of garments. And they said unto him, Put forth thy riddle, that we may hear it. And he said unto them, Out of the eater came forth meat, and out of the strong came forth sweetness. And they could not in 3 days expound the riddle. So after 3 days, they were getting concerned. How are we going to solve this problem? We better get somebody else involved to try and infiltrate Samson, to find out the secret of this riddle. So on the 7th day, that they said unto Samson's wife, entice thy husband, that he may declare unto us the riddle, lest we burn thee and thy father's house with fire. In other words, they threatened his wife. Friends, if you live in a wrong relationship, you're going to end up being compromised by that relationship. It's that simple. And so now, what verse are we in here? I lost my place. 15, thank you. And it came to pass on the 7th day, we read that, they threatened to injure her and perhaps even kill her if she did not find out the riddle. So Samson's wife wept before him and said, thou dost but hate me and lovest me not. Thou hast put forth a riddle to the children of my people and hast not told it to me. And he said unto her, behold, I have not told it to my father and my mother. Well, how shall I tell it to thee? In other words, he was keeping it very, very close to his chest, keeping it secret. Well, she kept on weeping, verse 17, before him, and the 7 days while their feast lasted. And it came to pass on the 7th day that he told her, because she lay sore upon him. And she wore him out, wore him down, actually. And she told the riddle to the children of her people. So in other words, she stabbed her own husband in the back to protect her family and her own life. Friends, if you don't marry someone that's committed to Jesus Christ, if you don't live with someone that is entirely encouraging you to walk with God, you're going to end up in compromise away from God's principles and God's plan. You cannot be effective as God's servant. So, 18. The men of the city said unto him on the 7th day before the sun went down, what is sweeter than honey, and what is stronger than a lion? And he said unto them, if ye had not plowed with my heifer, ye had not found out my riddle. In other words, you men put pressure on my wife. He found out about that too. So that, Friends, the problem here is that he was married to this Philistine. And by the way, she didn't survive either, ultimately. We'll read that a bit later. And the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he went down to Ashkelon and slew 30 men of them, and took their spoil, and gave the change of raiments unto them, which expounded the riddle. And his anger was kindled, and he went up to his father's house. So he left his wife, because she already was starting to undermine him. And Samson's wife was given to his companion, whom he had used as his friend. Oh, man. So Samson lost his wife. Verse 1 of chapter 15, it came to pass within a while after, in the time of the wheat harvest, that Samson visited his wife with a kid. And he said, I will go into my wife into the chamber. But her father would not suffer him to go in. And her father said, I verily thought that thou hadst utterly hated her. Therefore I gave her to thy companion. Is not her younger sister fairer than she? Take her, I pray thee, instead of her. Tried to give her another wife. Well, Samson said concerning them, now shall I be more blameless than the Philistines, though I do them a displeasure. And Samson went and caught 300 foxes. He was upset. And he took fire. Can you imagine catching 300 foxes? How do you think he did it? Boy. He must have been, he had a lot of traps, or he was fast. I'm not sure. The Bible doesn't tell us. But he caught 300, not just 3 foxes, 300 of them. Can you imagine? What did he do with them? Well, he turned them tail to tail, tied their tails together, and put a firebrand in the midst between the 2 tails. What do you think those foxes did? They'd try to run from the fire, wouldn't they? Well, they couldn't because it was attached to them. And when he had set the brands on fire, he let them go into the standing corn of the Philistines, and burnt up both the shocks and also the standing corn with the vineyards and olives. Whew. All their fields were destroyed, or at least many of them. Then the Philistines said, "Who hath done this?" And they answered, "Samson, the son-in-law of the Timnite, because he had taken his wife and given her to his companion. And the Philistines came up and burnt her and her father with fire." Where were these Philistines living? What is it called today? It's called Gaza. Have you ever heard of Gaza? The Philistines still live there. They are the enemies of God's people and will be, and they're still the enemies of what once was God's people. And so here we are, down here at the end of time, we have, as it were, this fight going on in the Middle East between the Israelites and the Philistines, or the Palestinians, as they're called today. I think that's extremely interesting. Somehow, God's last people, his remnant people, are going to understand this in a way that goes beyond just the literal application of this. Because those who are living in the last days have a message to bear that will turn the world upside down and will create problems for those, for both the people of the world and for God's people. Under the latter rain, God is going to work to bring these people to the truth. And those who accept it will, of course, be saved. Those who will not will be angry and will persecute God's people. And the Philistines are now determined to persecute Samson. So let's read on. Verse 7. Samson said unto them, "Though ye have done this, yet will I be avenged of you, and after that I will cease." This is after killing his wife and her father. "And he smote them hip and thigh with a great slaughter, and he went down and dwelt on the top of the rock Etam. Then the Philistines went up and pitched in Judah and spread themselves in Lehi. And the men of Judah said, Why are ye come up against us? And they answered, To bind Samson are we come up, to do to him as he hath done to us. So it's revenge and counter-revenge, back and forth, back. This is not God's way. But yet, God works in all of this. You know, the Bible says you can do nothing against the Lord but for the Lord. 2 Corinthians 13, verse 8. In other words, no matter how you fight against God, you cannot win because it will eventually work to the good of God's cause. No matter what you do. So there's no point in fighting God. You might as well collaborate with God, don't you think? Might as well do what God says. Live by his principles rather than be as Samson and actually do damage to God's cause. So you can stir up animosity by your behavior by the people of the world, as Samson had done. So then we read on, verse 11. The 3,000 men of Judah went up to the rock of Etam and said unto Samson, Knowest thou not that the Philistines are rulers over us? What is this thou hast done unto us? And he said unto them, As they did unto me, so have I done unto them. Oh, so it's not just that the Philistines are wanting to do what Samson had done to them. Actually, he said, I did what they did to me. You see, it just gets worse and worse. Now, they said, by the way, did you notice how many men there were of Judah that went up to talk to Samson about this? 3,000 of them. Not just 3 of them, not just 30 of them, not just 300 of them, 3,000 of them. That's a lot of people that were very concerned about what the Philistines were going to do to them if they didn't give Samson over to them. And they said unto him, we are come down to bind thee, that we may deliver thee to the hand of the Philistines. And Samson said unto them, swear to me that ye will not fall upon me yourselves. And they spake unto him, saying, no, we will bind thee fast, and deliver thee into their hand, but surely we will not kill thee. And they bound him with 2 new cords, and brought him up from the rock. Now remember, Samson was the strongest man alive at that time. And he let them bind him with these new cords, right? Little did anybody realize what Samson was going to do. Verse 14, and when he came into Lehi, the Philistines shouted against him. And the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him, and the cords that were upon his arms became as flax that was burnt with fire, and his bands loosed from off his hands. And he found a new jawbone of an ass, and put forth his hand, and took it, and slew 1,000 men therewith. So apparently sitting by there was a jawbone of an ass. And he slew 1,000 of them. They thought they had him trapped and cornered. They thought they were going to kill him. But he killed 1,000 of them instead. Now notice that it says the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon Samson. Samson was not living right. Samson had determined on his own track, his own course, his own way. And yet, God still mercifully used him for his own purposes. And God will do that. In mercy, God does that to people who aren't living right. He still uses them sometimes. And consequently, they continue to do their work, and they go on as if there's no consequences to their actions. But always, the wages of sin is death, both ultimately physical death as well as eternal death. And the Bible goes on to say that it came to pass that he had made an end of speaking, that he cast away the jawbone out of his hand. Verse 16. Samson said, with the jawbone of an ass, heaps upon heaps, with the jaw of an ass, I have slain 1,000 men. And it came to pass when he made an end of speaking, that he cast away the jawbone out of his hand, and called that place Ramath Lehi. And he was sore thirst, and called on the Lord, and said, thou hast given this great deliverance unto the hand of thy servant, and now shall I die for thirst, and fall into the hand of the uncircumcised? You see, he had no trust in God. If you're going to give the message of the last days, you've got to trust God. You have to have a walk with God that is beyond the normal walk. You have to have a walk with God that continually expands your confidence and your trust in the power and protection of God. God isn't going to leave his servant Samson without water so he dies of thirst. But God still answered his prayer. Look what happened in verse 19. God clave an hollow place that was in the jawbone of the ass that he'd thrown away, and there came water thereout. What an amazing thing. You could drink all the water out of the jawbone of that ass that he wanted to quench his thirst. Where did it come from? It wasn't there. It was God who put it there. It was an outright miracle. And God does this. This is another warning to Samson to turn from his evil ways and live by God's principles. But he failed to do that even so. And when he had drunk, his spirit came again, and he revived. Wherefore he called the name thereof En-Hakkore, which is in Lehi unto this day. And he judged Israel in the days of the Philistines 20 years. So half of the time that the Philistines were, in fact, it would be the second half of the 40 years that the Philistines were in control of Israel, that Samson judged them. And it says he judged him 20 years. Then in verse 1 of 16 it says, then went Samson to Gaza. Samson still had a problem. His problem was lust. His problem was immorality. Samson went to Gaza and saw there an harlot and went in unto her. And it was told the Gazites, saying, Samson is come hither. And they compassed him in, and laid wait for him all night in the gate of the city. And were quiet all the night, saying, in the morning, when it is day, we shall kill him. Well, Samson lay until midnight, and then arose at midnight, and took the doors of the gate of the city, and the 2 posts, and went away with them, bar and all, and put them upon his shoulders, and carried them up. Did you get that? Up to the top of the hill that is before Hebron. This man was powerful. He not only lifted the gates of the city off of their posts, but he took the posts too, put them all on his back, and then carried them uphill to the hill that overlooks Hebron. This demonstrates the strength of this man. I mean, this is a city that is not just barred with small doors like we have in our church here. You know, any man can pick that door, most any man anyway, and carry it perhaps even up a hill. But not the gates of the city. These are huge gates. They're big. And then in verse 4, he continues in his quest for ungodly women. It came to pass afterward that he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. And the lords of the Philistines came up unto her, and said unto her, entice him, and see wherein his great strength lieth. Now he was living with this woman. He was cohabitating with this woman. And he said unto her, entice him. Friends, what does a woman represent in Bible prophecy?
Church.
Now go deeper now. Think about this. Samson goes off to this Philistine woman and marries her. In an ecumenical relationship, if you will. Not only does he marry her, then after he divorces her, or rather she's divorced from him, he goes into an harlot. Another woman. Another false church, if you will. This is not an ecumenical thing. This is a relationship that is for pleasure only. Then he comes to a third woman. It's as if he's making the rounds between the various churches out there, having these relationships with them and engaging with them. And this one does him in. And friends, Delilah represents, in this story, Delilah would represent the same as Jezebel, or the one who brings the downfall of God's church. Friends, we have to be very careful not to be engaged in the ecumenical movement. It is as if it were spiritual fornication.
Amen.
And Samson, who is God's representative, the representative of God's church, goes in unto these women and engages with them. And eventually it leads to not only his downfall as well as those of the Philistines. So the Lord's, don't think that engaging with ecumenical activity, it's going to actually benefit God's cause. Because those other churches will conspire against God's people. All right? Look what happens. And the lords of the Philistines, of that false church, they came up unto her and said unto her, entice him, and see wherein his great strength lieth. And by what means we may prevail against him, that we may bind him to afflict him, and we will give thee every one of us 1,100 pieces of silver. Watch out. Bribery is involved. In the ecumenical movement, there is money involved. There is power involved. There is influence involved. And if you engage in these things, you will you will not become the victor. Verse 6, Delilah said unto Samson, Tell me, I pray thee, wherein thy great strength lieth, and wherein thou mayest be bound to afflict thee. And Samson said unto her, If they bind me with 7 green withs that were never dried, then shall I be weak, be as other men. He suspected that she was getting ready to do him in. Then the lords of the Philistines brought up to her 7 green withs which had not been dried, and she bound him with them. How did he let her do this? You know, he was testing the Philistines. And her, for that matter. But you wonder why he finally gave in. That just it amazes me that Samson actually gave in to this woman eventually. But you know, if you continue to engage with people of the world in their activities, in their desires and pleasures, you will end up succumbing to their influence and you will undermine God's people. And now there were men laying in wait, abiding with her in the chamber, in their bedroom. Must have been a big bedroom. They were all hiding in there. And he brake the withs as thread. Oh, sorry. There were men lying in wait, abiding with her in the chamber. And she said unto him, The Philistines be upon thee, Samson. And he brake the withs as a thread of tow is broken when it touches the fire. So his strength was not known. Delilah said unto Samson, Behold, thou hast mocked me and told me lies. And now tell me, I pray thee, wherewith thou mightest be bound. And he said unto her, If they bind me fast with new ropes that never were occupied, then shall I be weak and be as other men. Well, she was persistent and determined. She was going to try at least everything he says. And she says, The Philistines be upon thee, verse 12. And there were liars in wait, abiding in the chamber. Notice that they're liars. This is a different kind of liar than someone who tells falsehoods, but perhaps we can draw the same conclusion. Ecumenists will always tell falsehoods. And he brake them from off his arms like a thread. And Delilah said unto Samson, Hitherto thou hast mocked me and told me lies. Tell me wherewith thou mightest be bound. And he said unto her, If thou weavest the 7 locks of my head with the web. And she fastened it with a pin, and she said unto him, The Philistines be upon thee. And he awake out of sleep, and went away with the pin of the beam and with the web. So, in other words, his strength still remained. But did you notice the 3rd time it got awfully close? Sooner or later, they get close. And once they get too close, that is the harbinger of the end. So in verse 15, she says it again. This is the 4th time now. How canst thou say, I love thee, when thine heart is not with me? Thou hast mocked me these 3 times, and hast not told me wherein thy great strength lieth. And it came to pass, when she pressed him daily with her words, she really vexed him, and urged him, so that his soul was vexed unto death, that he told her all his heart, and said unto her, There hath not come a razor upon mine head, for I have been a Nazarite unto God from my mother's womb. And then he has to tell this Philistine woman why he's strong. He explains that he is really God's servant and that he has a work to do for God. And here he is. Can you imagine when she realizes this? Here he is, compromised with this woman. And she saw, verse 18, that he told her all his heart. And she went and called the lords of the Philistines, saying, Come up this once, for he hath showed me all his heart. Then the lords of the Philistines came up unto her, and brought money in their hand. And she said unto him, she made him sleep upon her knees, and she called for a man, and she caused him to shave off the 7 locks of his head. And she began to afflict him, and his strength went from him. And she said, The Philistines be upon thee, Samson. And he awoke out of sleep and said, I will go out as at other times before and shake myself. And he wist not that the Lord was departed from him. How many of us have dabbled with sin and we shake ourselves off from it? And finally, we lose our strength. And we try to shake it off the one last time. And we find that we are bound and cannot do anything about it. And that our strength, our spiritual strength, has gone. Oh, friends, don't let this happen to you. It is an enormous lesson for God's people in the last days, my friends. We are not to be involved in ecumenical things, and also in our own lives. We are to live as God instructs us to live, with the health message as well as with the purity of heart in all things. And he said, the Philistines be upon thee. That's verse 20. And then in verse 22, the Philistines took him and put out his eyes and brought him down to Gaza and bound him with fetters of brass, and he did grind in the prison house. He was grinding grain in the prison, a slave of the Philistines. The lords of the Philistines gathered them together. Verse 22. And howbeit the hair of his head began to grow again after he was shaven. And the lords of the Philistines gathered them together for to offer great sacrifice to Dagon their God, and to rejoice, for they said, our God hath delivered Samson our enemy into our hand. And then when the people saw him, they praised their God, and they said, our God hath delivered into our hands our enemy, and the destroyer of our country, which slew many of us. And it came to pass, when their hearts were merry, that they said, call for Samson, that he may make us sport. And they called for Samson out of the prison house, and he made them sport, and they set him between the pillars. And Samson said unto the lad that held him by the hand, suffer me, that I may feel the pillars whereupon the house standeth, that I may lean upon them. Now the house was full of men and women, and all the lords of the Philistines were there, and they were upon the roof of the house, 3,000 men and women that beheld while Samson made sport. 3,000 men and women were up on the roof looking down into the house. And Samson called upon the Lord and said, O Lord God, remember me, I pray thee, and strengthen me, I pray thee. Only this once, O God, that I may be at once avenged of the Philistines for my 2 eyes. And Samson took hold of the 2 middle pillars upon which the house stood, and on which it was borne up, of one with his right hand, and of the other with his left. And Samson said, let me die with the Philistines. And he bowed himself with all his might, and the house fell upon the lords and upon all the people that were therein, so that the dead which he slew in his death were more than they which he slew in his life. Then his brethren and all the house of his father came down and took him, and brought him up, and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol in the burying place of Manoah his father, and he judged Israel 20 years. What a sad story. This man could have been powerful as a preacher of truth. He could have done the Philistines in a way that God could have approved, and that God would have done much more to deliver the Israelites from the Philistines. But because of his moral or lack of moral fiber, even this man of God lost his way and his salvation in the process. Yes, God delivered the Israelites out of the hands of the Philistines eventually. But Samson lost his eternal life and his influence, not only among the Israelites, but also among the Philistines. Of course, he didn't have much influence among the Philistines. His influence was, of course, to cause them to fear. But even that, they no longer feared him. So, friends, these lessons for us are also very important in the last days. We are not to engage in the ecumenical movement. We are not to be involved with the daughters of Babylon, or the Delilahs, or the women of Timnath, or any other place where God might lead us, or where the enemy might lead us. And we are to live in pure and holiness, according to the health message, according to the principles that God has given us, so that we may give His message in fullness in these last days. May God bless us to this end.